Long days and pleasant nights, fellow explorers, if you're not sick of hearing me say that recently. But we are here today to do a Q&A for the channel. Normally, at the end of each series, I like to do a Q&A related to that series, although I do allow any question for every Q&A. But for this time, since the Celtic mythology series was so short, I didn't really get a tremendous amount of time to research it and delve into it for various reasons. I decided it'd be a better fit if I just did a general Q&A, just open to everything and whatever people wanted to ask. So we got a bunch of questions here. This Q&A will be about an hour long, or I run out of good questions, which might happen, who knows. Alright, so let's just dive into it. First question is from Thomas K96. Are there any movies that you are aware of based on or about Celtic mythology? Well, not especially. There's, of course, a lot of smaller Irish, Scottish, Welsh, etc. productions. Just these little sort of indie movies, older movies that make plenty of references to Celtic myths or different mythological creatures, things like that. I think the second Hellboy movie has some characters related to Celtic mythology, Nuada and things like that, although admittedly I've not seen the film. I think the Disney Pixar Brave movie has some Scottish mythological elements to it. Again, I've not seen it, but overall Celtic mythology is not among the most popular for multiple reasons. But you know, for a long time in the public conscience, it was Greek, it was Roman. Those were really the big ones and still are. It's only, it seems to me, only in recent times that we've started to really delve into other civilizations' mythologies. Norse, of course, is having its heyday right now. I don't know if Norse mythology has ever been quite as forefront, but there's, you know, shows that go into it. There's movies that go into it, of course. Games, God of War is a really big deal. You know, if every mythology got a game that was as well developed and well researched and included as many references and connections as the new God of War for Norse mythology, I think we'd all be pretty happy. And it seems like Santa Monica Studios seems to be looking to other mythologies, including Celtic mythology, for future games. So there might be a time in a decade or so when Celtic mythology is getting a boom and we might see a lot more stuff. But for right now, there's not a tremendous amount that I'm aware of. Joa Iga asks, what was or is your favorite thing to explore? Well, as far as series go, like a whole series, of course I'm a very big fan of the Cthulhu mythos. That's what started all of this. That was my first series, so that's always going to be pretty close to my heart. A lot of those were very entertaining to research, because when I first did it, I thought that I was fairly knowledgeable of the Cthulhu mythos, but as you continue to research, you always find out new things. And then doing the Cthulhu mythos in Bloodborne video, which was a lot of work, it involved playing a lot of Bloodborne, but that was really just a perfect cap to the entire Cthulhu mythos series. There might be down the line some more for that, but that was a really entertaining series. Norse mythology was a big surprise for me, because before that I knew almost nothing about Norse mythology. I knew that Thor and Odin existed. I mean, they were gods. That was about it. Loki, you know, not much. So that was a really big surprise to me. I would have never. So that's why I kind of like doing the polls. I have a lot of people tell me, like, why do you do polls? Why don't you just pick what series you want to do? And I always now reference Norse mythology because I would have never picked that, because I didn't know anything about it. I didn't really ever give it much thought, but that won the poll, and I was really nervous doing it, but it ended up being one of my favorite series to cover. So that's why I like doing the polls, is I get to explore stuff that I never would have otherwise. Every series I've done has had some really interesting videos that I've enjoyed working on. The Middle-earth series was certainly very interesting, getting into the nitty-gritty of a lot of these things. Celtic mythology, the sons of Tyrion, or I already forget pronunciations. I apologize. That was a very entertaining video. My exploring video that I did on the Kowloon walled city is definitely one of my favorite videos I've ever done. Because every single week pretty much I'm looking at all these fictional things, these ancient things, things that these people believed, or things that these authors created, these designers, developers created, blah blah blah. But the Kowloon walled city and my other history videos, looking at how fascinating and just surreal and interesting the real world can be, actual history. That was a really awesome video to work on. So yeah, I mean, I'm kind of all over the place with what I like to explore, which is sort of how the channel has become what it has. Lutess asks, my question relates to the Cthulhu mythos. Nyarlathotep is the only biological offspring of Azathoth, correct? So if he is indeed an offspring of reality, not Azathoth's dream like the rest of us, does that mean he is real? Let me reword my question. When, not if, Azathoth awakens and everything in the universe will reduce to nothing, will Nyarlathotep vanish with everything or coexist with the blind idiot god? Because he is not an offspring of Azathoth's dream, but reality. Well, it's a very loaded question. I feel very fortunate that I can actually answer a question like this. Most people would just glaze over. So the first part was Nyarlathotep is the only biological offspring of Azathoth. Okay, that's really the brunt of the question here right off the bat. When you're talking about the biology, genealogy, the family tree of the Cthulhu mythos, most of the time you're going to be looking at a little genealogy that Lovecraft put in a letter to one of his friends. And that genealogy, I believe, it has Azathoth at the top, and then right below him is Nyarlathotep, the Nameless Mist, and Darkness, or the Darkness, I don't remember. And then splitting from Nyarlathotep, he apparently mingled with the Roman Empire, and it sort of goes down the line of humans until it eventually gets to H.P. Lovecraft. So it shows him as a sort of a direct connection to Nyarlathotep and Azathoth. The Nameless Mist, I believe, is sort of the progenitor of a few of the more well-known mythos entities. I think Yog-Sothoth and Cthulhu are in that line, and then the Darkness, I think, it's sort of a separate connection. So, I mean, just from that, Nyarlathotep is not the only thing that comes from Azathoth based on just that. You also have the Nameless Mist and the Darkness, whatever exactly that is. And everything else comes from those. So based on that genealogy, of course, everything comes from Azathoth. But Nyarlathotep is not singularly pointed out. Now, that whole thing is very tongue-in-cheek. It's pretty much meant to be a joke. I believe that one of his friends mentioned something about him believing he's a descendant of Jupiter or something like that, and so Lovecraft sort of made a joke with this genealogy showing that he's a descendant of Nyarlathotep and Azathoth. So, you know, the that's the thing with the Cthulhu mythos, though. If you want to think that Nyarlathotep is a spawn directly of Azathoth and not part of the dream, all the power to you. Honestly, you know, roll with it. But for me personally, first of all, the entire concept of biology, genealogy, you know, connection to, you know, fraternal connections and all that is completely ridiculous when discussing mythos entities. It's an incredibly human, you know, normal concept applied to these very alien entities. But for me personally, I just would rather believe that Nyarlathotep is part of the dream just as everything else is, but he is really the caretaker of Azathoth, trying to keep him asleep, because if Azathoth awakens, he disappears along with everything else. That's just what I like to think, but there's nothing that says otherwise. You know, there's nothing that says you can't think whatever you want, and that's Cthulhu mythos. Generic name 987 asks, how did you get into TES lore? Well, it won the poll, and then I started researching it. That's pretty much it. I was familiar with aspects of it before that, and obviously I played some of the games, but to be perfectly honest, you know, I'm very big into video games. That's how I spend most of my time. But when I'm normally playing video games, I like the mechanics. Like, I really do not ever give much thought to story or lore or anything like that. Like when I first played through like Skyrim, I don't know if I read any of the in-game books or anything like that. I'm just normally I'm just very mechanically focused. Even, you know, when I'm playing like a turn-based RPG, if the story just does not super grab me, I don't mind just skipping dialogue and skipping cinematics just to get to the gameplay. That's just how I like to play games. That's what I'm there for, is to play games. Not that games can't produce interesting stories, of course not. It's just when I'm sitting down to play a game, I like to be doing something. I like to be, you know, playing something. If I wanted to really get into a story and immerse myself in dialogue and events and stuff like that, I would be reading a book. And that's just how I am. So, you know, when I did the Elder Scrolls series, that's when, okay, it's like, okay, the gameplay really does not matter at all now. I need to approach this video game series entirely from a lore story perspective. And so those are two different approaches, but it's not like I don't mind looking at a video game from a story perspective. It's just normally when I'm playing on my own, it's always very mechanical. Jared Dugai. I'm sorry, I'm terrible with pronunciations, as most of you know. My question is, do you have any knowledge about the Marvel Universe? Both films and the comic universe. And additional, is there any future plans to cover the MU or the MCU? Yeah, so you'll note that I am wearing a Marvel Hulk hat, but I'm also wearing a Flash shirt. So, yes, I am a very big fan of the MCU. I have seen pretty much every Marvel film on opening night. As for comic books, right now I'm currently reading through all the Hulk comics, from the very first one back in the 60s to the present. That's taken a very long time. I'm just doing that in my free time, and I've been enjoying it a lot. If you're curious, I got the sort of Marvel Unlimited subscription, which gives you access to an absurd amount of comics. So I've been enjoying that a lot, but most of the time if I'm reading something, it's going to be a novel, generally fantasy. So comics is sort of like a special thing that I'm doing for the Hulk series, of just, I want to just read up on the Hulk, because he's my favorite Marvel character. you know, comic books at this point in time, trying to just get in there and read up on decades and decades of backstories and arcs and all these characters, and it's incredibly exhausting to even think about. So that's very tricky, and for so long it's just sort of passed me by, and I just never cared, especially back in the day when it was all physical. Like, it's just mind-boggling. Now with like a subscription service and things like that, where you have access to everything, you know, 6 months behind or whatever, it's a little bit more feasible. I don't know if I'll ever get around to really catching up on everything. And so that, of course, brings to the second part of the question of if I ever plan to do any videos about Marvel or the MCU or DC or whatever. Yeah, I mean, it depends on the polls. It's never gotten anywhere close on the polls, I don't think. Either Marvel or DC. That would certainly be, it would be entertaining to me, probably, because I am a comic book, I like superheroes, so that would certainly be entertaining to me. Tricky, yes. Summarizing, you know, a 40 or 50 year, whatever, even longer character history in like a 13-minute video is tricky. You're leaving off a lot of things. But, you know, that's the polls. That's how I decided to run my channel. If people are interested, I will be there. The OK channel. Where do you think man's, I kind of want to say, obsession with fantasizing things that go bump in the night comes from? And why are so many people drawn to what we know isn't out there? Well, as for the second part, I mean, drawn to what we know isn't out there. The entire breadth of what mankind knows is probably pretty tiny in the grand scheme of things. So, you know, it's hard to say what we know and exactly what we don't know. Where do you think man's obsession with fantasizing things that go bump in the night comes from? Well, that's certainly a tricky question. I think mankind generally is very curious. I think we're a very curious species, which is mostly worked out in our favor. We generally have a desire to know things that we don't know or understand, and that allows us to continually progress forward and propel ourselves forward to go where we haven't gone before. You know, back in the age of exploration, you know, that's how we got to cover the world, and that's never really stopped. We always want to keep looking where we haven't looked. And so, you know, when you're walking outside at night and you're looking around and you see this area that you can't really observe, for a lot of people there's fear, darkness, and all that. It certainly brings a lot of fear to many people. But that curiosity never really goes away. We always want to shine light on things that are in the dark. So that, I think that's been a pretty driving force, sort of encoded into our DNA. And it'll probably never go away as long as we're human. The Nebula Effect. What story/subject was your first experience into deep lore that you were invested in? Mine was Lord of the Rings. I want to say Dark Souls. That's the one that really just stands out in my mind. Maybe there's something else. I mean, sure, I've been interested in looking into stories for, you know, years and years. But Dark Souls was the one that really surprised me, because when I first played Dark Souls, I, like many other people, was just interested in the game. You know, it was a difficult game, and it was a very engaging, challenging, entertaining game, and you were just fighting through it, and the story was always sort of just off in the distance. You never really bothered to look that much into it. And so, I played through the game and I loved it. And I had been watching a YouTube channel, some of you probably know, Epic Name Bro, who was a very big force early on for Dark Souls on YouTube. And he started to go into the lore of Dark Souls. He started to make videos about it. And he would mention it while he was playing through the game and discuss different aspects of the lore. And my eyes were just open. All these different item descriptions and little pieces of dialogue from all these characters, they all just sort of cohesively blended together to create this picture of a much more interesting, deeper story than I had thought. And so this game and this series that I had just thought, oh, these are awesome, challenging games, I really enjoy playing through and blah, blah, they were hiding, at least in my eyes, this secondary aspect that was incredibly interesting. So that was the really first, that was before I watched Body Video, who obviously made much more polished videos on the subject. That was really the first big experience that I remember where my eyes were open. But at this point in time, now I'm well familiar with looking deeper into stories and tales and things like that. Silk Rabbit 13, what are some good books to learn about the lesser known creatures of Greek and Roman mythology? Unfortunately, I cannot answer this. Not at this point. You'll need to ask this again after I cover Greek and or Roman mythology. It's a sad fact that at this point in time, and this point in my life, I am not just an encyclopedia of knowledge. With every series that I do, I get to learn more and more and more about mythologies and fictional franchises and series and things like that. It feels like my brain is continually growing bigger, which is great. But sadly, outside of all that, when I'm, not covering a series, like I haven't covered a series, generally my knowledge is hit or miss. I don't spend my free time delving into research, I guess. So ask me again some other time. Callum asks, have you ever tried creating your own mythology? If not, you could totally do similar videos to what you normally do about it. I've had this question a few times, I think, suggesting that I write my own stories, write my own novels, make my own series, blah, blah, blah. When I was briefly in college, I thought about trying to become a screenwriter, and I wrote a couple of screenplays which were utter trash, let me assure you. I had, for a while, toyed with the idea of writing a novel, but primarily I'm pretty lazy, and also I'm a very concise writer, which to me never really sort of lended itself to writing novels and things like that. Like throughout high school, I would always, I'd had to write papers and blah, 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 and I would always get marked for just writing too short. I would just never write enough. And I always thought, I mean, my thought was always, you understood my points. This is not poorly written. You just don't like that I didn't write enough. And I was always too concise, which coincidentally, I think works very well for what I do now on YouTube. At least in my opinion, I've become very adept at summarizing. But summarizing and writing novels and creating my own worlds and things which generally require this fleshing out of information and all that, it's not really the same thing. So I don't really have any interest at this point in writing my own stuff because I'm just continually discovering all these other creations and stuff from other people that have done such a great job. I don't really need to do my own. It's the same. It's like I don't feel the need to make my own video game. It's the same sort of thing for me. Native Injun asks, can you cover the Hopi? I don't know if you mean in this Q&A or do a video. Right now, I don't think I can say much more than their tribe of Native Americans in the Arizona region. I can't imagine that ever... Well, actually, sort of Native American mythology could win the poll at some point. I shouldn't say never. But, you know, a lot of like one-off videos that people ask me to cover. Like, I've done a bunch of history videos. Some of you are probably aware. And the history videos never perform that well because they're out of series. So people come to the channel, you know, 98% of the time, and they're like, wow, you know, this guy's covering Tolkien, this guy's covering Elder Scrolls, this guy's covering Norse mythology. I'm really interested in that. And so they subscribe to the channel thinking that that's what I do. And so that ends up with, I think I have an inflated subscriber count, but the actual like super loyal fans of the channel is a pretty low number comparatively. Because people discover that, oh, he's moved on. He doesn't make any Norse mythology videos anymore. What's going on? What is all this other stuff? And then they just fall off. And people never unsubscribe, or almost never unsubscribe. They just don't watch anymore. So things like, you know, doing videos out of series, they almost never get watched. Not really, because the big views generally come from an established series that I've done, and it's a really hot topic within that series. So doing the one-off videos is rarely worth it. Oftentimes very entertaining, but generally not worth it. So when I'm thinking about what videos to do in next week or the next few weeks or a month from now, it's generally like, okay, how am I going to plot out the series that I'm currently working on? Rarely do I think, okay, I should fit in this video here, because I'm just focused on working on a series. It's a bummer either way, but that's just kind of how it is. Luke Jameson asks, cover the well-developed, in-depth, lore-filled universe of Minecraft. Okay. One day there was a person, and he started mining and crafting, and he never stopped. Done. Eolus asks, do you know what your cultural background is? Italian, Irish, Danish, etc. Well, a lot of my family comes from the Germanic region, Polish, things like that. My dad was actually born in Germany and moved here when he was 10 or 11. My grandmother, on his side, escaped from World War II out of Poland, or I believe. So, as far as I know, it's within that region, very Germanic, but I've never really looked into it that much. He also asks, have you read the A Song of Ice and Fire novels or watched Game of Thrones? I have watched Game of Thrones. I've seen every episode. I'm very excited to see it end. Well, that sounds wrong, but I'm very excited to see the finale. But I have not read the novels. Not exactly sure what put me off from them. I don't know if I was incredibly knowledgeable about their existence before the show. And then the show started, and I started watching it, and I think I thought about reading them, but I was hesitant for one reason or another. Probably length was the main reason at the time. And then I think I just spent too much time on the internet. I had been completely spoiled about the books by internet people, and I was like, I'll watch the show, but yeah, I've never gotten around to it. If, of course, the series ever comes up and wins a poll, I will make an effort to read through the books, but at this point, no. And finally, he asks, have I seen The Yellow Sign? I don't know what you're talking about. Pedro Lucas has 3 questions. Could you make some videos explaining symbols in different mythologies, like the triquetra? It's sort of the same thing for the standalone videos. It's just, yeah, that would probably be an interesting video for me to work on. Maybe, you know, there are certainly some standalone videos outside of a series that could be very popular. But it's very hard to know how YouTube works, how the internet is drawn to things. You know, sometimes you can really see a hot button topic like right away and go, oh, if I make a video about this, it'll be big. You know, that was pretty much the God of War Norse mythology video. I was like, this is going to be big. And it turned out to be pretty good. But, you know, a sort of a mythological symbol video, it's hard to say. As a history lover, are there any mythology books you would recommend? Well, I've only very recently gotten into mythologies. Norse mythology is the first one I really looked at in detail. But as part of that series, I did read Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman, which was a very good read. I'd recommend that to almost anybody interested in mythology, Norse or otherwise. It was very entertaining. But most of the time, in my free time, I read just high fantasy novels and stuff like that. So historical books, mythological books, things like that, that's generally reserved for while I'm working on a series. So that's just how it is. Please consider exploring the Witcher series, since it has a lot of interesting stuff. Of course, it narrowly lost the most recent poll. That's why you gotta rock the vote. I really have no... I've tried to stay as hands-off as possible. Sometimes I veto things, and of course I submit my own vote. But I try to stay as hands-off from the whole process as possible to be impartial, which I realize some people don't like, but there's no pleasing everybody on it. Like, as many people are going to dump on SCP Foundation and all that, would be just as many people that would dump on The Witcher. And for every single series that I cover now, there will be multiple people that say, why are you doing this? There's so many channels and videos devoted to this. Why don't you do this? Doesn't matter what series it is, there will be people that will say that. So, it's just funny. Weed Blaster asks, how do you feel about the talks of Elder Scrolls 6 being in Hammerfell or High Rock? Which do you think it is, and which would you prefer? Well, I think it's High Rock. And I would probably prefer High Rock. Hammerfell is largely desert. And I just don't know how interesting that would be. You know, if it's sort of a... You know, if they sort of go for a larger region, they combine High Rock and Hammerfell. And so you get a bit of desert there, but most of it's sort of mountainous. That might be good to sort of break up the monotony. Overall, neither of those are really high up on my list of preferred. I would have preferred Akavir, of course. Elsewhere, Black Marsh would have been really cool, but it seems like they're playing it very safe. Peter Lucas asks, what are your thoughts on the possibility of a Middle-earth set TV series? Well, I don't think it's not I mean, it's happening. Amazon is doing it, so I guess it's not a TV series, but Amazon is certainly doing a Middle-earth series. They have their budget, they have their writers and all that. It's certainly moving along. It seems to be based on young Aragorn. I'm always of the mindset I'd rather have something than it never existed in the first place. 99% of the time, that's how I feel about stuff. There is some occasions where somebody creates something that actively makes an entire franchise or series or whatever worse. Like, my entire mindset is worse because of it. That almost never happens, though. The only example is the fifth Paranormal Activity movie, the one set in Mexico, or what are the marked ones? That made that series worse, in like retroactively. But that's a different subject. So, you know, they very easily could never make another Middle-earth Tolkien series, and our lives would move on. But they're gonna make this. If it's good, awesome. If it's bad, oh well. I mean, it's not gonna make Tolkien's works worse because of it. Most likely not. So I'm certainly interested. They're throwing a lot of money at it, so hopefully it's good. Paul Axis asks, have you ever played any of the video games you did lore videos about, Elder Scrolls, etc., and favorite Daedric Prince from Elder Scrolls? As mentioned, yes, I have played Elder Scrolls. Before I did the series, I had played Morrowind, Oblivion, and Skyrim. While doing the series, I started with Arena, the first game, and I replayed through all the games. Favorite Daedric Prince is probably Hermaeus Mora, just due to the obvious connection to the Cthulhu mythos. Aside from that, Sanguine or whatever is pretty cool. I'm actually not a big fan of Sheogorath. I mean, by itself, he'd be all right, but it's sort of like all the meme activity that I have to deal with and read, and just the sort of community and fan base around him is just so LOL random. It's sort of bothersome. Help asks, Marvel or DC? Okay, so in the movie world, there's no contest. I think for most people, there's no contest. Marvel has done their due diligence. They put in the proper amount of work, and they put out some very entertaining movies. But, you know, in the comic book world, there's hit and misses on both sides. I like each side for different reasons. You know, it's always been explained that in Marvel it's men trying to become gods, and in DC it's gods trying to be like men. But obviously it's both sides have crossed over into different territories with power scaling, and you could do a whole, you know, hour-long discussion about this concept. I would probably pick Marvel overall, but there are aspects of DC that I enjoy. I like the DC. I mean, it's anything that I could say about liking DC. I'm sure there are things you can point to Marvel where, like, oh, they did that. They had this whole arc, or they had this whole series, or whatever, where that exactly happened. So it's sort of a horse apiece. I think most of the time you're just looking at characters, and I probably prefer Marvel characters overall. But I like Batman. I don't like Batman fans, but I like Batman. Of course, I like the Flash. He's probably my favorite superhero. Superman. A lot of people strongly dislike. I have friends that just hate Superman, but they really don't. I think a lot of people that dislike Superman don't read a lot of Superman comics. So I'm not a hater of Superman. Yeah, overall I would say Marvel, but it's pretty close. Like I said, I'm wearing a Marvel hat and a DC shirt, so. What else do we got here? How long have we been going? 40 minutes, okay. David Ortega asks, do you think people in ancient times saw mythology more like how we see history, or more like how we see modern lore? Well, I mean, it depends on the time frame. It depends on the people. There were certainly times. I mean, of course, for all these civilizations, there were times when they certainly believed, I think, aspects of their mythology. They worshipped these deities. They made their sacrifices and their prayers and all that, and you know, a Norse warrior rushing into battle made his silent prayer or non-silent prayer to Thor, or you know, things like that. But as time went on, for a lot of civilizations, of course, Christianity was very widespread and sort of entered the public conscience, and these aspects were pushed back and pushed to the side. A lot of the times, probably forcefully. They wanted to wipe these old heretical concepts out. So it was sort of just a development. But I mean, it wasn't like, I don't think for a lot of these people way back in the day, they were just like, let's make up some stories about these gods. I think there was certainly a lot of belief, and we have evidence of that. Armored Crocodile asks, what are your favorite video games, books, and comic books? Okay. Favorite video games, the Soulsborne series is probably my favorite series of video games. Aside from that, there are a handful of Final Fantasies that I'm a big fan of. I just recently played through every mainstream Final Fantasy game. Baldur's Gate 2 for a long time was one of my favorite games. The Fallout series I'm a pretty big fan of, although more so the first two games. I mean, there's a lot of Super Nintendo RPGs that I grew up with that I would still love to replay. Chrono Trigger, Breath of Fire series, Lufia series, Secret of Mana, Secret of Evermore. I wish more people talk about Secret of Evermore. Let's have that one a poll sometime. Yeah, mostly I'm an RPG fan, which is funny because I don't, like I said, I don't play games for the story most of the time. But I just really enjoy turn-based gameplay. But overall, I consider myself a pretty big gamer. It's how I spend most of my time. And I try to pick up most, you know, new big titles. I'm not too snobbish about things. My favorite books. My favorite book series is probably The Dark Tower, as some of you would have guessed. And it's probably the only series that I'll just have a perpetual veto for as far as me doing a series, which I'm sure I'll have to repeat myself in the future a bunch of times about that. It's just such a series that, like, I don't know, just personally connected with me, just emotionally. I don't know, that series was just wild for me. And so it just would feel wrong for me to make a video series about that, I feel. And, you know, it's my decision, so it's how it is. But, yeah, I try to jump around. I try to, you know, when I was in high school, and I was, you know, in my teens and early 20s and all that, I almost never read anything. I just had a very different perspective on life, so I just did not read much. So nowadays, now I have to try and catch up on all these readings that I could have been doing my whole life. So right now I'm sticking to mostly modern fantasy, the big hits. Brandon Sanderson, I read a lot of stuff, most of his stuff. Patrick Rothfuss, of course. I'm of the same opinion of most people about him. Right now I'm reading through Joe Abercrombie's First Law trilogy, which has been really interesting. The Gentleman Bastard series by Scott Lynch is very good. I would like to see that continue at some point. Yeah, you know, as time goes on, I'll start looking towards some older series. People always have recommendations for me, so I like to read. I don't spend a tremendous amount of time reading outside of like research purposes, but I try to read a little bit every day. And my favorite comic books, I think I've sort of discussed that. XWBXW4R. What got you into Lovecraftian horror / lore? I think I've answered this at some point, but I believe it was the Call of Cthulhu RPG. My friends and I got into Dungeons and Dragons when I was 20 or 21, and we spent a number of years playing D&D, and then I, of course, spent a lot of time on the internet, you know, looking at things, researching things, and I was like, oh, there's other RPGs out there. And I think at the time, I don't know if it still is, but on RPG Geek or something like that, there was like a list of the top RPGs of all time or something like that. And number 1 was Call of Cthulhu. I was like, oh, this has got to be good. So, of course, I looked into the Call of Cthulhu RPG, and I was like, well, what is this Cthulhu stuff? Who is Cthulhu? And I was like, oh, Lovecraft. Oh, okay. And I think I bought the Call of Cthulhu RPG book, and for most of the editions, at the front of the book, they had the whole Call of Cthulhu story. And so I read that. And I was like, this is pretty cool. I should read more. And that was it. My hentai girl asks, is there any way you could put music in your video? Fantasy, Celtic music on a low volume so your voice could be clear. This is very funny to me. It cracks me up every time somebody brings it up about putting music in my videos. Because I have to tell you, there has never been an exploring video that has not had music in the background. That is part of the editing process, is me handpicking music and putting it in every single video. So I think people probably just listen to it fairly quietly, each of my videos. They do not blare it. My mindset has always been, I want music in the background to fill in sort of gaps, to lend a little bit more to the video, of course. But I never want people to like focus on the music, because I watch videos where the music is kind of loud, and it's not that I can't hear the person, but I start thinking less about what they're saying and more about, oh, that's a really good music track, I know that from somewhere, blah blah blah. And so I never want that, and that's the same reason I don't almost never put any text in my video, is I never want anything to take away from what I'm saying, which is not an egotistical thing or anything. It's just the primary purpose of my videos has always been to educate. And music, text, well, text a little bit can help, but usually that stuff does not exactly lend itself to the education process, more with the entertainment process. And it's really sort of a misguided thing, because most of the people watching my videos are already pretty well familiar with the topic. They just like to, you know, hear other people talk about it. So there are plenty of times where people come in and say, wow, I learned this, I didn't know this, and they didn't know much about the series and now they know more. And that's always like, yes, all right, that's awesome. But most of the time it's people that just correct me on my pronunciation and things like that. So yes, I always put music in the Celtic mythology series. Most recently, I've started to bump up the volume a little bit, and I've started to be like, you know, because I've heard this here and there throughout the last couple of years. So I'm like, okay, I can probably bump it up a little bit. If people are really like, they don't even know it exists, that's probably a little quiet. So I've been trying to bump it up a little bit. Hopefully in future videos you can hear it. But yeah, I have always made the effort to put the music in. Wicked Nemesis, how do you feel about the monk class in 5th edition, and which race and martial class do you prefer? Okay, let's talk about Dungeons & Dragons real quick. So I play, we have an RPG night at my house every single week, more or less. I do live streams of these on my other channel, Mang's LPs, if you're interested. We have not played Dungeons & Dragons in a few years, a couple of years. 5th edition was the most recent D&D system that we played. When I first got into D&D, it was 3.5 edition, and I played like one session. I was in my room feverishly for like weeks, just coming up with characters, because we were going to play D&D someday. And so I had just sheets and sheets and sheets of characters. But we only played like one session. It just fell apart. And so years later, I'm like, let's get into D&D again. because as the ultimate nerd of our group, it was on me to initiate this. And so we looked into D&D then, and 4th edition was the new hot thing, so we all picked up that, and we played 4th edition for a while, and it was, I mean, we didn't really have anything to compare it to. It was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. And then 5th edition came out, and that's sort of when we fell off, because by that point, as I mentioned, I had been looking at other RPGs. I had looked at Call of Cthulhu, and so this whole new world of RPGs has been opened. And so 5th edition definitely has its merits. By far the most popular RPG. It's certainly a great starting point. But for me, with all these other RPGs in here, out there, and I'm fully okay with bouncing around and trying out all this new stuff. For our group, we'd rather play Dungeon World. We'd rather play Shadow the Demon Lord. Dungeon Crawl Classics is a new thing that I've discovered that seems to be really interesting. And that's just fantasy games. We have Call of Cthulhu or Sprawl, which I did make a video on this channel. All sorts of other stuff. So I'm really not up to snuff on 5th edition D&D. I'm sure it's a fine game, but it's just not something we're super interested in. Snow asks, are you thinking about continuing exploring topics in Elder Scrolls or Star Wars? Yes. When, I can't tell you, but I'm sure there will be another Elder Scrolls video at some point. Star Wars, probably, actually. Generally, when I go on like vacation or a trip or something like that, I work ahead. In my free time, I prepare other videos. And so during those times, that's usually when I look to other series. So the next Star Wars video I'd probably make would be on droids, I think. Looking at all the different droids. I think that would be pretty interesting. But yes, I try to never say that I'm fully done with a series, because I think there's always more things to explore. Okay. FV Guy asks a few questions here. Favorite SCP? Of course, we'll be looking much more into SCP in the future for those of you that are not familiar with it. My favorite SCP is probably 354, which is the Red Pool, I believe. That was one of the first ones that I read, and the exploratory log just grabbed me, and I was like, I'm in this whole thing. This is really cool. But I've fallen off of SCP recently. I just didn't look at it for a while, so they've come out with hundreds and hundreds that I haven't read. So of the ones that I have read, the early days, 354 was my favorite, but there was a lot of good ones. He also asked, what is my favorite video game series? That is Soulsborne. I don't know. I mean, Bloodborne might be my favorite game of all time, but Final Fantasy VI is really up there as well. Baldur's Gate 2 is really up there as well, so it's hard to pinpoint. But series would be probably Soulsborne, if that's a series. He also asks, any stories of Middle-earth you wish to see be adapted into film? Yes. The Tale of Baron and Luthien is my #1 choice for that. I think it's just it's a very complete tale that I think would be probably best suited to be converted into an actual film. I think it has everything you need for a movie. So that would be my pick. And finally, any favorite cartoon/animated series? Well, I mean, if we're just talking like anime, if we just look at anime, Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood is definitely up there. Really love that show. Steins Gate, Made in Abyss is a recent one that was really good. I'd love to do a series on Made in Abyss once it gets further along. I think that's awesome. The first half of Death Note. Dragon Ball Z is just something from my childhood. It was just like every day after school just watching Dragon Ball Z, and you know, when we were younger, we were in martial arts in real life. So, you know, we were just kids, and we were always channeling Dragon Ball Z moves when we were in class and stuff like that. So that was a very awesome personal series from when I was younger. Apart from that, like Western animation cartoons, not really. I don't think I spend too much time watching that. I mean, when I was younger, but nowadays I'm more of a sitcom fan than a cartoon fan. Harem King Mikey. If you could choose to have one thing from all the Exploring series that you've covered be real, what would it be? Oh boy. I guess the Force would probably be my choice. I think there would be a lot of problems that would arise from the Force being real. And, you know, who's to say how Force sensitive I would be, but just the chance that I could just, like, grab something from out of reach and just bring it to my hand, I think that would be worth it. John Bailey, what are some of your favorite YouTube channels to watch? Okay, I watch a bunch of YouTube channels, actually. That's how I spend a lot of my time, multitasking. But, as I mentioned, Body Vidya. I try to watch every new video he puts out. Lobos Jr., I watch a lot of his YouTube uploads that he puts out because he's a very talented Soulsborne player. Kriparian, when I used to play a lot of Hearthstone, I got into watching Kriparian, and I still watch a bunch of things he uploads, even though I don't play Hearthstone too much. I watch a board game channel, The Dice Tower. Of course, I like watching their top 10 videos. Entertaining group of guys that I've met a few times. I also watch Techmoan. I got into that channel very randomly. Somebody, I think on Reddit, was like, oh, this is a great channel to binge watch. And I was like, what do I care about, like, old school hi-fi recording music equipment and stuff like that? But I've seen like every video that guy's put out. Just for some reason, fascinating stuff. Also, LGR, pretty much the same sort of vein, although a little bit more related to my interest because he does a lot of gaming stuff and computers and stuff. But same thing, just a very binge-watchable channel. That might be it that I sort of watch regularly, like I check every day for. I'm always a little wary, I'm going to be perfectly honest. I'm always a little wary to like branch out and find a new channel. Because it's like, I'm just going to be fully invested in this channel. I'm going to watch everything they do, and then I have to check another channel every day. And my entire day is just going to be filled with watching YouTube videos, subscription uploads. Oh, Dunkey, of course. Because everyone subscribed to Dunkey. We just got like a minute or so here. What sort of books or other materials do you like to consult when doing prep work for a series? Okay, well, I try to approach it like it was a school subject or something. Wikipedia is almost always used. That may bother some people, but Wikipedia has always served me as an excellent foundation point. By itself, it is not the end-all be-all, as you should be aware, but it lists a bunch of great sources, and for some very small tangential topics, it is proven very useful to me. I've just, both as part of the Exploring series and just living my life, I've always found Wikipedia to just be a great, entertaining site. I always try to find 2 or 3 other websites sort of devoted to the topic that compile information and things like that, that have written articles or whatever. If there's a primary source, which, I mean, there almost always, there's a primary source. So like, if it's a video game series, The Elder Scrolls, I consult the video games. You know, I consult the games themselves. I try to read over anytime like an article or something mentions a quote or an in-game book. I always try to find the actual source and read it myself to interpret it that way. If it's a book series, I try to read the books, things like that. If it's a mythology, I try to find, you know, the earliest sources that I can, the translations, and read those. And then I also will, at the start of a series, I'll try, you know, if it's that type of series, I'll try and find some actual books written about the topic. So for Norse mythology, Celtic mythology, when I started those series, I ordered a few different books, sort of the well-known books related to the series, just to give a different perspective, and maybe mention some tidbits that I can include in a video. So I try to vary it as much as I can, to go from the original sources, different interpretations, different summaries. You know, I never like copy paste or anything like that. I hope I'm a little better than that, but sometimes different summaries can give me a good idea of how to approach summarizing a subject. It's not, when I'm doing this, you know, it's not all about me understanding the subject material. I also have to best decide how to summarize the material. So that's both what I need to include in the video and what not to include in the video. What is not important and what can be left out for someone to discover on their own. So, you know, I try to be as comprehensive as possible, but there's always stuff I miss. All right, let's do... let's do one more and let me find a good one. I mean, there's a lot of decent ones here. I guess I could just pick one. Oh, here we go. Frederick von Ackerman. What new series do I want to do the most? This is good. So like I said, this is why I do the poll, is so I can discover new things that I normally would never do, such as Norse mythology or even SCP. I don't know if I would have done a proper series on my own. Every single time I do the poll, I always vote for Warcraft. I make it no secret that I vote for Warcraft. And of course people say, why don't you just do Warcraft? And it's like, no, this is how I run my channel. I'm fine with it. You know, if I was really upset about, like, oh, I hate this series, why should I do this? That's never happened. But if I was like that, then whatever, I would just veto it. I still maintain some control. But the reason I like to do Warcraft is, one, I'm just a fan of the entire series, the universe. I just like, it has its problems, but so does every series and franchise and blah, blah, blah. I just like it. And two, it's a series that has, for the most part, a pretty clear-cut lore. You know, video games are usually pretty good about that. Just, you know, I don't have to deal with, like, ancient texts, or I don't have to deal with reading a dozen books or something like that. It's a pretty clear-cut series, or lore for the most part, and artwork. That's really the main reason why I don't want to do another mythology series, is the artwork is just few and far between. I don't like using sketches and like pencil artwork and, you know, without color, and just like old stuff from the 1800s and so on and so forth. And so artwork has been rough. But, you know, Warcraft, you have just a tremendous plethora of art from fans and from concept art, from in-game stuff, all sorts of things. And I think it would just sort of be a kickback, easier series for me. But it's not to the point where I'm like, I'm going to do Warcraft, I don't care what anyone thinks. I'm fully invested in doing the polls, and I like that whole process. And so last thing, Gary Campbell Greer asked, do you enjoy making episodes for this channel? Absolutely. There's almost never a video where I'm like, this is obnoxious to me, or this is boring to me, or I can't stand doing this. You'll notice in the last, I think close to 3 years now. I've never missed a week with an episode, and that's just because I really enjoy what I do here for the channel. So that's it for the Q&A. Thanks to everyone that submitted questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to everything. I tend to ramble. We'll do another Q&A after the end of the next series, and you're always welcome to ask any questions you want. I hope you enjoyed my rambles, and keep exploring.